once again, thank you very much for coming out to this wonderful lecture here at the Frontier Culture Museum. I want to thank the Virginia Humanities, Lee Enterprises, and the American Frontier Culture Foundation for making this lecture series possible. They've been wonderful supporters, and without them, we wouldn't be able to offer this program to all of you. And this evening, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker, Warren Milteer Jr. He is an assistant professor of history at the George Washington University. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2014. His publications include 2 academic books, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, and we do have some copies for purchase after the lecture in the back. And Professor Milteer is happy to sign them for you as well. The other book that he published is North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885. The independently published Hertford County, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Their Descendants from 2016, as well as articles in the Journal of Social History and the North Carolina Historical Review. And I would just love to share a quick review with you that another scholar wrote about Beyond Slavery's Shadow, and it shows you what you are looking forward to tonight. With Beyond the Shadow of Slavery, Warren Milteer has written an important book. Anyone who studies the history of the American South or even the United States should strongly consider reading this book, as it ably and by and large convincingly reframes the history of free people of color in the American South in a way that reveals a great deal about their history and the history of the American South itself. This deep scholarship is a portrait of the South's free people of color that is complicated, nuanced, and attentive to individual and regional diversities. So please join me in welcoming Professor Milteer.
All right, thank you all so much for coming out. I really appreciate you taking this time out of your evening to be here. So I want to tell you a little bit about my research on the topic of free people of color in the South. And so for those people who aren't familiar with the term free people of color, this is a term that was used primarily in the late 1700s and first half of the 19th century to describe people who were free during the period of slavery, who were either of some mixture of African and or Native American ancestry. I also found a few examples of people with ancestry from Asia who were also classified as people of color during this time period. And so what I want to do today is, first I want to read a little bit from the book to help introduce the topic. And then I will give you a little bit of background information about free people of color, and then we'll get into some of the individual stories that I cover in the book. Of course, I can't talk about everything, but hopefully this will give you a basic understanding of this topic, free people of color. All right, so in the introduction of my book, I talk about the life of a man named Amariah Reed. And I write about Amariah Reed and I say that Amariah Reed lived out a life that was typical of many men of his generation in the South. Born a subject of the British Crown around 1762 in Nansemond County, Virginia, by age 16, Reed had enlisted in the effort to overthrow British power in Virginia and several other colonies. After participating in various skirmishes against British forces, Reed was present for the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Following the war, Reed returned to Nansemond County, settling down on an 80-acre tract with his growing family by the early 1800s. Reed's 80 acres eventually became the inheritance of his children, who would continue to prosper from the foundations laid by their father. Yet Amariah Reed also stood apart as a man who was born free in a time when most other people of color in the future U.S. South were born enslaved. Unlike the majority of people termed, quote unquote, colored in his community, Reed could and did hold title to personal and real property. He could work for himself, provide for his family, and keep his wages without interference from a white master. In the courts of Virginia, he could sue and be sued. As a free person of color, however, he was also subjected to an increasing number of restrictions and forms of legal discrimination. Since the time of his birth, Virginia law prevented him from enjoying some of the civil rights possessed by his white male neighbors, including the right to vote and the ability to hold public office. When Reed decided to spend the rest of his life with Betsy Skeeter, Virginia law prohibited them from marrying because he was quote unquote colored and she was quote unquote white. By the time of his death, the state had passed laws that prohibited Reed from traveling freely between Virginia and other localities, required him to obtain a license in order to own a gun, and demanded that he register with county officials in order to receive documents proving his free status. Reed was wedged in the precarious position of being both free and yet a person of color. So Reed's story helps to open up the larger story of free people of color in the South and helps to explain a couple of things that are important to this book that I'm talking about. One is what the major goal of the book is, or what the major argument is of the book. And so in this book, what I'm doing is I'm tracing this back and forth between opportunities for free people of color and the challenges that they face from the colonial period all the way through the Civil War time period. And so I find that in many instances, free people of color face numerous challenges, often legal challenges, also discrimination on the ground. But then at the same time, some of them are able to find a place in society to succeed. They're able to find jobs, participate in the economy. They're part of the community in many places throughout the South. Now, the story of Reed is also important because it tells you a little bit about my own interest in this topic. And so Reed is my ancestor. He's my fourth great grandfather. And so I got interested in the topic of free people of color through learning about my own family history. And my interest in family history eventually became the center of my historical scholarship as a professor. Now, I wanted to share with you a few of the documents that I used to build the story of Reed. Let's see. So here, this is just a snippet of Reed's pension application. So he filed for a pension many decades after the American Revolution and described how he participated in the Revolution, including his presence at Yorktown. Then this image here is from a tax list from 1840, and this is where I got the information about the amount of land that Reed owned. Reed lived in Nansemond County, Virginia, which is now modern-day city of Suffolk. And so the records for Suffolk, most of them burned during the Civil War. And so I had to find a way to reconstruct his story without those court records that so many people use to fill in the gaps of their family histories. And so these tax records were kept by the state, and therefore I was able to find out that bit of information about Reed. And then this is a really interesting image from the 1830 U.S. federal census, and you can see Amariah of Reed and white wife. And so this is helping to fill in the gap about his connection with Betsy Skeeter. And so you can see that even though legally they were not recognized in their community as a married couple, people on the ground still saw them as such and treated them as such. And I think this record does a good job of reflecting that. Now, the interesting part about the story in my family is that Amariah Reed had been forgotten in my family, whereas we did know about Betsy Skeeter, who was his white wife. This image here, just to give you a little bit of background, this was mentioned in the introduction that I had written a couple of other books. And so this is also, of course, part of how I got to the topic of free people of color in the South. I started looking at local history first and eventually moved up and wrote a book about the larger region, which I thought was necessary to fill in some of the gaps that people didn't understand about free people of color in the South. Now, I wanted to share with you, before I get into some other details, some demographic information about free people of color. So I don't know how many people are coming in with familiarity on the topic of free people of color, but when people think of the topic, they usually point to places like Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, Louisiana. But you can see from this graphic here that a large percentage of free people of color are actually located in the upper South, and not in places further in the deep South, which you can see towards the bottom for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions. So Maryland clearly had the largest population of free people of color in the South and had the largest population of free people of color in the United States, followed by Virginia. And Virginia is also second, not only in the South, but in the whole entire country. And then we go on from North Carolina, Delaware, Louisiana finally shows up at number 5. Now this visual is the same information, but in this pie chart form. And so you can see that this part here is representing Maryland. This is Virginia. This blue is North Carolina. This is Delaware. And so you can see that the upper South already is well more than 50% of the population of free people of color in the whole region. And towards the bottom, you have places like Arkansas and Texas, and they don't actually show up on the graph because the line is too thin. Now, the story about Arkansas is kind of interesting because in 1860, the census had been taken right after Arkansas passed a law requiring all free people of color to leave the state or be enslaved. So most of them had already gone. There were never that many there in the first place, but that's why the number there is so small. Now this particular data here is just breaking down the population by smaller localities, counties, parishes. And so you can see that the trend for the most part is the same. You've got a lot of counties from Maryland, many of them people have never heard of before. Delaware counties, which Delaware only has 3 counties, but they all had large populations of free people of color. You see some Virginia. You do have Orleans Parish, which would have included the city of New Orleans. Just to give you a little bit of background on that, so right under Orleans Parish, you see Washington, D.C. Now, at this particular time, Washington and Georgetown were considered 2 separate places within the District of Columbia. So if you included Georgetown's numbers with the Washington numbers, then you would have a slightly larger number of free people in the District of Columbia than you had in Orleans Parish. But they're pretty close. So for the rest of the time, what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about some of the individuals that I found in my research. And in my book is broken up into 7 chapters, and so these examples fit within the various chapters of the book. So the first chapter of my book covers the colonial period, and in this case, we're going to say roughly end of the 1600s through the mid to late 1700s. There's a little overlap between chapter 1 and chapter 2. And of course, the colonial period varies quite a bit in the South because you have places like Louisiana, places like Florida that remain under colonial governments much longer than, say, Virginia or North Carolina, which, of course, declared their independence during the Revolution. And so in this chapter, I talk about the different laws that are developed that circumscribe the lives of free people of color. Many of those laws in the colonial period are class-based laws. So free people of color who tend to be poor tend to see a more strict version of the law than those who have more wealth. And so this is particularly the case with people who are in the servant class of free people of color. And then in the rest of the chapter, I talk more about this divide between, as far as the lived experience of free people of color, the divide between those who were more well-to-do and those who were poor. And so in the section about those people who were a little more challenged when it came to their financial circumstances. I talk about the case of a man named Isaac Cromwell. And so Isaac Cromwell was a servant working in the 1700s in Frederick County, Maryland. And in this image here that you see, this is a image from a newspaper where a reward is being offered for his return because he and his partner or wife, I'm sure they considered each other husband and wife, had run away. And so Anne Green is his partner, and she's described in here as an English woman. And he is described as a mulatto man. And so they ran away, and their master is trying to recover them. Now, after I wrote the book, I found out that this wasn't the first time that Isaac Cromwell had run away. Apparently, he had been a servant in, I think it was New York, and had tried to do the same thing, and I'm assuming got caught, brought back, and continued a life in servitude. Now, on the other side of the spectrum for free people of color in the colonial period, you have examples of individuals like William Chavis. So William Chavis was situated in Granville County, North Carolina, or what would have been Granville County, North Carolina at the time. So this is mostly like north central North Carolina for those people who are not familiar with that area. And so Chavis, I found to be one of the more well-to-do free people of color in his community, and one of the more well-to-do free people of color, the more well-to-do people in general in his community. And so he was a landholder, he owned a tavern, apparently he could read and write, and he also was a slaveholder. And so in this particular image, you see a deed for one of his land purchases, and there's several of these throughout the records in North Carolina documenting his exchanges. He shows up in the court a lot. He's suing people. He's being sued. A lot of that kind of activity that you would expect for somebody who has money and wealth and is engaged in business. Now, the second chapter of my book goes into the revolutionary period in the South. And again, this is a kind of a broad period because there are many revolutions beyond the one that takes place here in the United States. But we could say this is roughly 1760 to about 1800 is the time period that I'm covering in the second chapter. And so during this period, there are a few important things that happen. First of all, we have an expansion in freedom during this time period for people of color. So there are more opportunities in this late 1700s period for enslaved people to become free people. Some of that has to do with changes in religious attitudes. Some of that has to do with the revolution and the rhetoric around that. But people are taking advantage of the situation, both the enslaved people themselves and those people who want to help them in some way, and they're obtaining their freedom. Also going along with this, we see an increase in the number of people who are being held in slavery suing for their freedom. So what has happened is, in the colonial period, people have been placed in servitude, many of them for long periods of time. So, for instance, in the colony of Virginia, right, if you were a person of color and your mother was white, you were automatically born out of wedlock. And so therefore, you could be placed into servitude for up to 31 years. And so you have this large number of so-called mulattoes who are in servitude for 31 years. And part of the requirement while you're in servitude is to not have children. And of course, that's very difficult for most people by age 31 in this environment. And so they end up getting punished for having children. This is specifically women. And their children are placed in servitude for an additional 31 years. And then the mothers end up serving more time in servitude. So this creates a lot of confusion over the status of certain free people of color because there are babies being placed into 31 years of servitude, and their day-to-day treatment is not that much different than that of enslaved people, although their legal status is different. And so those people sometimes are being treated as slaves and have to go to court and sue for their freedom once they've hit age 31, And of course, you've got to be able to document that you're actually 31 years old or have somebody testify saying all of that. So it can get really messy. But we see a lot more of that activity taking place in the late 1700s than we would have seen earlier in the colonial period. It did take place then, but there's more of it because there's more organizing going on, especially in the Upper South. You have Quakers, you have anti-slavery organizations that have popped up, and they're helping people to sue for their freedom. And then there are also individuals who are very crafty and figure out how the court system works, and they go and they sue on their own. One of those individuals that I talk about in this book is a woman named Phyllis. So Phyllis was from Delaware, and in the late 1700s, she sues for her freedom based on the fact that her grandmother was a free woman. And so the story goes that her grandmother was originally from India and had come here as a servant, as a free person though, and that through the years she ends up being considered a slave, although she's not. So what happens is one of her a white woman who knows her family, has known them for generations, comes to the court and testifies about her mother's status, her grandmother's status, what her grandmother looked like, where she came from, all of this kind of thing. And through that, she was able to obtain her freedom. And so we see multiple instances of this same kind of thing. Most of the cases, I would say, are people who descend from white women. But in this case, we have somebody whose grandmother was from India. Now, in this same chapter about the revolutionary period, I not only talk about people obtaining freedom, but I also talk about the experiences of those people who were already free and had been free for a while and what they're doing in this moment. And so one of the individuals that I discuss is Benjamin Banneker, and some of you have probably heard of Benjamin Banneker. He was originally from Maryland. And one of his major accomplishments was producing an almanac that was widely used. Now, in addition to his almanac, Banneker dedicated some of his time to what we would call today a civil rights movement. And so he spoke out about the problems of people of color. He called out some of the politicians of his time for hypocrisy, because these are the people who had led the surge for freedom in the United States, and then were also holding people in slavery. And one of those individuals that he calls out specifically is Thomas Jefferson. And so he and Jefferson have a whole back and forth where at first Jefferson celebrates his accomplishments as a scientist, but as he gets deeper into his political career, his opinion changes, and he starts to say that Benjamin Banneker did not produce his almanac, that he doesn't actually know all this stuff. And so it gets kind of messy. But Benjamin Banneker's story is part of the larger story that I tell. Now, going on to the book's third chapter. The book's third chapter starts with the early 1800s, so it covers roughly about 1800 to 1830. And so what we see in this time period is what I describe as a bit of a backlash to the expansion of freedom that took place in the late 1700s. So we see many states passing laws restricting the freedoms of free people of color, and those laws vary widely. You see registration laws pop up where free people of color need to go to court and register themselves. Now, to what degree they registered that's another story. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but it became the law. There are restrictions on movement. So you see states that want to prevent free people of color from other states coming into their jurisdictions, or if people leave the jurisdiction, they want to keep them from coming back. So you see a lot of that. Port cities are starting to put restrictions on the sailors who come into their communities. So sailors of color are often required to either stay on their ships or be placed in jail while their ship is at port. So those are the kind of things you see. Also during this time period, we see the formation of a national level and also state level colonization societies. And so the colonization movement was a movement that was attempting to take free people of color or people who were about to be emancipated and send them out of the country. And so when this movement first pops up, there are various ideas as to where to send these people. Some people are focused more on the Caribbean. Other people are thinking about Africa because the British already have a colony there. So the focus eventually does shift primarily to Liberia and Africa, and so that's where we get Liberia is basically from this colonization movement. And so the proposal of having free people of color go to Liberia, for some free people of color seems interesting. For others, they are like, absolutely not, I'm not leaving my home. And so with this mixed reaction, you have some people who end up going to Liberia, other people who stay. The majority of people, of course, stay. Now, why people go to Liberia? Some of them see it as an opportunity for freedom that they would not have in the United States. They'd be able to vote. They would be able to not deal with some of the discrimination that they would deal with here. Other people see it as a potential opportunity as far as a financial opportunity. And so the individuals we have here, that was their primary concern from what I can tell. And so Joseph Jenkins Roberts became a trader between the United States and Liberia. And that's what motivated him to go to the area. He's originally from Virginia, and this is his wife, Jane Waring Roberts, who's also from Virginia. And so they've moved to Liberia and set up shop there. Eventually, Joseph Jenkins Roberts will become the first president of Liberia. Now, you'll start to see that I have a little bit of a pattern in this book. In my fourth chapter of the book, I go back to the same period, 1800 to about 1830, but I'm also looking at the daily lives of free people of color, not just the restrictions that are being placed on them and the activity of the people who are trying to put them down, but I'm trying to also see how are they living despite all of that. And so in this chapter, I talk about their community life. I talk about the way that they participate in the economy, the institutions that they create to live their lives. And so one of the major institutions that you see starting to pop up in different parts of the South in this period are churches. And so most of this activity, I would say, is taking place in the Upper South in places like Maryland and Delaware. To some degree in Virginia, although it can be a little messy in Virginia, depending on the time period. And so one of these major churches that I cover is Bethel Church in Baltimore, which is still around today. And I think many of the people who attend that church are aware of that church's legacy. But what you're seeing in this early 1800s period is a shift in attitudes in some churches about the equal participation of people of color and white people in the same spaces. And so you start to see internal segregation in the churches, people of color not being able to have equal voice in the church administration. And so some of them end up founding their own churches so that they can have those opportunities. You also see the foundation of schools by people of color during this time period. Some of the schools are attached to the churches or fraternal organizations. Some of them are independent where the parents can pay for the child to go to school. One of the people who was instrumental in the development of schools in Baltimore was this man, Daniel Coker, and he was a teacher and also a minister. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I cover the role of free people of color in the local economies. And I talk about the variety of different things that they do. So you have some people who are working on farms, some people who have their own businesses as craftspeople. You have restaurant owners. And one of these restaurant owners that I talk about is Amelia Shadd. She was based in Wilmington, Delaware, and she's advertising for an oyster hotel in basically, this is like a restaurant and a place where you can stay for the night. And she's explaining to you what kind of food she's offering. The language is very lively, I guess you could say. You see this a lot in the different newspapers. Oysters, also turtle soup apparently was very popular in this time period. I have not had turtle soup. Some people say it's pretty good. I don't know. Now, of course, I've now talked about good things happening, people being able to participate in the economy. I got to go back to the other direction. So in chapter 5 of the book, I cover the period from around 1831 to about 1860. And one of the major events that takes place, particularly here in Virginia, is the Nat Turner Rebellion, which took place in 1831 in Southampton County. And so I'm trying to figure out in this chapter what was the effect of the rebellion on free people of color. And from what I can find, it was, of course, particularly important in Virginia, specifically in North Carolina. The effects are a little bit, they're less significant in other parts of the South, I would say, not necessarily insignificant, because you do have politicians who try to take advantage of the situation and pass legislation that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to pass, prohibiting free people of color from doing a variety of different things, maybe reading and writing, owning guns, things of that nature that they had failed to do before, and the rebellion gave them the opportunity. Now, in the case of Virginia, there's quite a bit of activity, especially towards the Tidewater area in the counties surrounding Southampton. And so I learned a little bit about that information by reading some of the remembrances of a man named Willis Augustus Hodges. So Willis Augustus Hodges, during the rebellion, was living in Princess Anne County, Virginia, which is now Virginia Beach. It looked much different back in this time, of course, and he talks about the different happenings in his neighborhood related to the rebellion, how certain characters took advantage of the situation, started invading the houses of people of color, arresting people on petty crimes that they weren't necessarily going to arrest people for before. So for instance, the registration law that I mentioned earlier, Virginia had a law that required free people of color to go to court and have themselves registered. And so you would register a description of yourself, what you looked like, how old you were, and the registration would explain how you became free. And some people did this, but a lot of people did not. It seems that for the most part, as long as you were in your community, most people knew who you were, and they knew the difference between those people who were enslaved, those people who were free, the white people, the people of color. And so it wasn't necessary, and it cost money to register. But when we have the rebellion take place, all of a sudden, oh, you need your papers. Where are your papers? Also, there was a law passed in Virginia in 1806 that required people who were freed, so these are enslaved people who gained their freedom, to leave the state. And so that law was also sporadically enforced, and I think there are a lot of different reasons why that was the case. But again, people had gotten away with this for decades of not being registered, but then all of a sudden during the rebellion, we see, oh, where are your papers? If you don't have your papers, you're going to jail. And so Hodges describes some of this. He explains that, you know, he sees this as purely manipulation on the part of the people who are enforcing the law at the time. People are being jailed, and then what would happen is if you were jailed and you couldn't pay your fees, you would be hired out to work. So it's just, you know, exploitation on top of exploitation. And we see a lot of that, especially in Virginia. It seems like Virginia came up with a lot of the bad ideas, and then they would spread throughout the South. Now, in this chapter, I go beyond just the Turner Rebellion and talk about some of the things that happened afterwards. I talk about for instance, the Arkansas law that I mentioned to you earlier on that tried to expel all the free people of color from Arkansas. That was a movement that took place not only in Arkansas, but across the South, but in all the other southern states, it failed to some degree. Sometimes it was the governor vetoing the law or the bill that had been approved by the state legislature. Sometimes it failed in the state legislature. There were a variety of different things that happened, but it didn't make its way in the way that it did in Arkansas. Now, Virginia was able to pass a few laws that basically allowed the enslavement of prisoners, so people who have been convicted of crimes could be sold and enslaved for the rest of their lives. But again, that didn't even happen in many other parts of the South. One of the other things that I talk about in this chapter is a tightening on rules relating to relationships between free people of color and enslaved people. So there's always this idea out that free people of color are going to assist enslaved people to freedom. And so state legislatures are constantly trying to police that, create tougher laws to stop that. And for instance, here in Virginia, you saw the passage of a law that prevented free people of color from owning any slaves. So unless they were like family members, you see that kind of thing. Because Virginia had this 1806 law that required free people to leave, so therefore some free people of color who had enslaved relatives would buy their relatives and hold them as slaves, because that was the only way they could legally keep them here without them having to go outside of the state. Now, in this whole section, I talk about a few examples where free people of color actually do try to help enslaved people to freedom. And one of the individuals that I cover is this man, Leonard Grimes. So Leonard Grimes was a free man of color. He was originally from Loudoun County, but had become based in Washington, D.C. And so what he would do is he would cross over into Loudoun County and help enslaved people to freedom. And eventually, he apparently made some bad decisions and got caught and was put on trial and sent to the state penitentiary for 5 years. So after his time in the state penitentiary, he goes back to DC, but eventually moves up to Boston, where he continues his anti-slavery work, helping runaways in that region. And he also becomes a minister, and so that's why he's dressed in this fashion. Now, the book's 6th chapter kind of goes along again with the pattern that I've set up. So I've talked about many of the challenges that free people of color are facing in that 1831 to 1860 period, but still, free people of color in the period from 1831 to 1860 in parts of the South are finding opportunities to make it and try to expand the success of their families. And what I find is that while some parts of the South have tried to shut down avenues for freedom, like Virginia, for instance, you have other parts of the South, especially those parts further to the west, places like Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, where the populations of free people of color are still expanding pretty rapidly. They're not going to get to the same size as a place like Virginia, but they are expanding. And actually through much of the South, there is growth overall. It may be slow growth compared to the growth that we would have seen, say, in the late 1700s during the Revolutionary War moment. But there's still positive things happening for free people of color. And so in this particular chapter, chapter 6, I talk about businesses again. I also cover education, religion, and how people have expanded their opportunities during this time period. One of the individuals that I cover in this section is Daniel Payne. So Daniel Payne is originally from Charleston, South Carolina. While he's in Charleston in the mid 1830s, he sets up a school there, but eventually leaves Charleston because the conditions are getting too harsh. And he comes to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, he's involved in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but he's also serving as a teacher, a community leader. And so he talks about his experience. He wrote a biography later in his life, and that biography is really important to my study. One of the individuals that I cover who was relatively successful during this time period was a man named Washington Spradling. So Washington Spradling was based in Louisville, Kentucky during this mid-1800s period. He was originally born enslaved, but became free. His father was white and freed him. And so in his adult life, he's a barber, and apparently a very successful barber, has quite a bit of money. And so what he does is he uses his money to loan to other people in his community, specifically people who are enslaved. And so what they'll do, they'll borrow money from him and they'll buy their freedom. And then once they're free, they're supposed to work and pay it back. He says some people succeed in doing that and others fail. Now, one thing I found really impressive about Washington Spradling's story is this grave marker. So you can't see the whole monument in this picture, obviously, but just to give you a sense of how big this monument is, I'm going to say it would probably touch the top of that screen. His monument is one of the largest monuments in the cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. And from my understanding, this is a cemetery that has both white people and people of color in it. So that's pretty impressive. I guess his family wanted to say something about him and his status in life through this monument after his death. Now, one of the interesting things that I also found in my research and covering this particular section is free people of color in the South going to college during this time period. So I found that there are some free people of color who will send their children out of the South because they're not allowed to go to college in the southern states, and they will send them to the North to obtain a college education. So they're going to places like Boston, they're going to Ohio, the places like Oberlin College where they will be able to attend. And so one of these individuals who leaves the South is John Patterson Sampson. He ends up going to a school called Commerce College in Massachusetts. And his father was an artisan in Wilmington, North Carolina, was very successful. And so I think he was able to use that success to send his children away to obtain higher education. Now, the last chapter of my book covers the Civil War period, so 1861 to 1865. I talk about the various experiences of free people of color during the war. Largely what I find is that free people of color are trying their best to maintain the freedoms that they still have by this time period and not to lose any additional freedoms, because of course that idea is always out there. And so they do this in a variety of different ways. Some of them are just like trying to get along, right? They're participating in daily life as they were before. Some of them end up being impressed by the Confederate government, so they're digging trenches, things of that nature. And then as the war goes on, by the time we get to about the midpoint of the war, some free people of color start enlisting in the U.S. Army. So a lot of that is taking place after the Emancipation Proclamation, which allows for that enlistment. And one of the individuals who enlist is this man, Moses Hammond. Hammond is originally from Frederick County, Maryland. He serves first as a soldier, but then ends up helping in the hospitals later in the war. I also talk about this lady here, Mary Smith Peake. So Mary Smith Peake is from the Tidewater area, or Virginia Hampton Roads area. She's a teacher, and so during the war, she ends up setting up at Fort Monroe and helping to teach the recently emancipated children and adults how to read and write, because these are people coming out of slavery, never had any kind of education before. Sadly, during the war, she passes away, and so her work is incomplete. And then I conclude the book by talking about the legacy of free people of color, what impact they had in the immediate post-Civil War period, Reconstruction. So some of them are serving as politicians. They're able to use some of the, or build on some of the opportunities that they had before the Civil War to help their communities after that period. And so I talk about that. And I also talk about how some of the events that happened in that pre-Civil War period had an impact on life later on in the South and the nation more largely. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you have, and I appreciate your attention. Yeah, I mean, so in the federal census, what happens is all free people are counted. Enslaved people are counted too, so you don't get like list of names of every individual until 1850. But before that, you will have like the head of household. So if you're a free person of color and you're the head of household, generally you would be listed in the census with your name. And so in this particular county, for some reason, the census taker decided to put the names of free men of color who had white wives, and he mentioned that they had white wives. So this was not the only instance of that. But well, they would have been counted in the census, and then the 3/5 part comes in when you're trying to tally up for representation. Yeah.
So the other question was, so they were able to go to court to sue and be sued.
Right.
And they could testify.
Well, that's the problem. So in most of the southern states, they were not permitted to testify against white people in court. So that could create some challenges, especially if you have a lawsuit or something. So you need like documentation, or you need a white witness. And so, I mean, some people are actually thinking like that, you know, they're going to get a white person to witness everything that they do so that they, if there's something that comes up, they can use that in court. So there are free people of color who find creative ways to still win lawsuits against white people, even with that being the law. But there are other people also who are facing a lot of challenges, especially if you're like running a business and you're using credit to, you know, have people come into your store and buy something, or they get a haircut on credit or something like that and then don't want to pay you.
Is there a primary way that the majority of people that were free became free?
Yeah, so that's a tricky. I think that we can say that during the colonial period, it seems that the majority, at least in the South, are probably born free because their mothers are white or Native American, and so that's how they would have become free. But then as we get into that revolutionary period, it seems that manumission, so the process of becoming free legally for enslaved people, has a more important role in the expansion of the population. But I think that some of that is also regional. So you see more of that type of activity in places like Maryland and Virginia, maybe less so in other parts of the South, but it's present everywhere.
Much more complicated was it in Louisiana, where the population was so much more polyglot than the rest of the South? It must have been horribly complicated to figure out who was who.
Right, yeah, I think, yeah, that definitely was a problem. The legal system was a little bit different in Louisiana as well, the legal traditions. So I think you can make an argument that in certain cases, free people of color had a little bit easier in Louisiana, especially maybe in the colonial time period. But as we get closer to the Civil War, the laws are getting more difficult for a lot of free people of color, and some of them are actually leaving Louisiana and going other places like Mexico. Now, one thing I think that you could also say is that a lot of the more well-to-do free people of color live in Louisiana. So that plays a role in how they're able to protect themselves legally as well, because if you've got a lot of money, you have more options than somebody who's poor, right? And so you can pay the best lawyers to defend you in court. You probably have better social connections and can prevent certain things from happening to you. And so I think that plays a role in the situation for some of the free people of color there as well. Yeah, in the back.
Can you talk to us about the documents? I mean, you know, today we can put documents in safes on our phone and all this, but I always think when I'm reading histories about how tenuous these documents must have been, how forgeable they were. So talk to us about how these, particularly people already in a precarious place in society,
Yeah.
documents made sure that they were.
Right. So you're thinking like about free papers and things of that nature that people kept. Yeah. From what I can tell, it seems like people were doing a lot of different things. Some people would, you know, have like special folders or things that they would have for their papers. I will say that I think it's very clear that these papers were important to people because of the number of families that still have them. even to this day. They may not have anything else related to their families, but these things have been passed on from generation to generation, and you find that occasionally. These are documents from the 1820s that people still have in their hands, which is pretty amazing. I've seen an instance where there was, this is I think in Nansemond County, Virginia. Apparently some of the free people of color gave their papers to this Quaker man who was kind of well known in the community, and he would keep their papers for them. And so after he died, then the papers actually were passed down in his family and ended up in an archive from when one of his descendants gave the papers to a library. So yeah, they're taking a lot of different paths to trying to protect their papers. And you'll see, especially in Richmond, because apparently these laws about keeping your papers were more strictly enforced in Richmond than other parts of Virginia. You'll see newspaper ads where people are advertising for the return of their papers because they'll lose their papers, and they're offering rewards for their return. So that also tells you a little bit about the importance of them. And as far as like forgery and things like that, I mean, that is something that happens. It's something that lawmakers are trying to keep up with, and to what degree they're able to, I think varies a bit. It's harder to police these things in the city than it would be in a small county where everybody knows everybody. So, yeah.
It sounds to me a bit like the states had a very free hand in devising and imposing caste systems.
Right.
On these people. And I'm wondering what, if any, role in either enforcing or sometimes countering it did federal legislation or the federal court system take?
Right. I mean, I would say that the federal government didn't help the situation for free people of color. But yeah, a lot of this activity is state level or even local level. So you'll see little cities passing ordinances trying to police the rights of free people of color, or take away their rights. Having curfews for free people of color. You can't be out past 9 o'clock. You might see that being passed at the local level. And those situations are really hard to decipher as far as the impact on people's lives, because sometimes we see these laws passed and we know, okay, this was probably not really enforced. But some of the local laws, it's really difficult to figure out to what degree they were enforced, because we don't have the voices of the free people of color in the quantities we would want. And often little towns don't keep good records. So we don't know if, the sheriff or the constable or whoever was in the town was really, to what degree they were harassing people. We get a sense here and there, but we don't know from a larger picture. But yeah, as far as the federal government is concerned, I would say their role is minimal. One place where I think the federal government tends to be important is there's another way to document your freedom, which is to get like either a passport or some type of like, they would give like sailors documentation. There was special documentation for sailors. And so these were often used as ways of proving freedom as well. That's how Frederick Douglass escaped to freedom, is he borrowed somebody's papers who was a sailor and pretended to be free on those. Yeah.
My fourth great grandmother was free. She was born about 1805. And I've got copies of the freedom papers that she had carried.
Right.
Well, it makes reference to a certificate from Ranko County.
Right.
But unfortunately, in the Richmond area during the Civil War, all of those records were pretty much burned up, and you can't find that particular certificate.
Right.
And that's a never-ending search for me. I'm looking for that. Of course, I'm also looking for. She died right down here in Mount City.
Okay.
In this area.
Right.
I cannot find out when she died.
Right.
And the gentleman asked something about carrying a certificate. Her husband lost his papers,
Okay.
and he had to go to court and had to have someone testify, someone white testify for, yes, he did have his papers, and they restored his papers. It was a carting off to jail. I mean, put back in state.
Right. Right.
It's very interesting to read the history of what's going
Yeah, it's a very messy time, for sure. In the back. In the back, yeah.
When we were talking about the Quaker man who was holding papers in Surrey County, there were a whole host of gay missions in the 1790s, and the assumption there by the Historical Society was that it was related to the Quaker Church basically prohibiting slavery after a certain period of time. How many other religious organizations helped push for that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there were some others, I would say not to the same degree. I think the Methodists were involved in some manumissions for a while, but you know, in the South, a lot of these churches eventually go in a different direction. And so their participation in the anti-slavery movement and the process of manumitting people, I don't think is quite as great. And sometimes it's difficult to exactly figure out the motivations of people when they're manumitting people, because some states will require so-called meritorious service. So you need to explain what this enslaved person did that merits them to obtain their freedom. And so you might have somebody who's actually doing this for a religious reason, but they're going to give a different reason officially. And so it's hard to decipher. And then it also takes the research to figure out, like, okay, what religion was this individual that I'm looking at? Some communities, like you said, Surrey County, you can kind of figure out who the Quakers are in that community and identify that this is what they're doing. But other places, it may be a little more difficult. In the back, you had it.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any information about free people of color organizing fraternal organizations and trying to help other people through that means.
They do found fraternal organizations. I see more of that, more evidence of it in the cities, in places like Baltimore, Charleston, New Orleans. We don't know a lot about those organizations. Some of that is because, you know, the records just didn't survive. And so what you'll see is a newspaper article that mentions that the organization's having an event. So they might host a ball, or they may have a fundraiser for a school or something of that nature. And so we know a little bit from those records. A lot of that type of material would have been held in individuals' hands. So I've understand that there's a case of that in New Orleans where there was an organization that was around for many years, but all the papers are in personal hands, so nobody really knows what's in them. But yeah, they do exist. And as far as like their role with helping enslaved people, that's hard to really decipher because we don't have the information, and you wouldn't put it out in public. You wouldn't advertise, of course, in the newspaper that that's what you were doing. So yeah. I wish we knew more.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have one more question?
I was wondering about the churches. You mentioned Bethel in Baltimore. Were there other free people of color establishing churches further south? And if so, were slaves able to attend those churches? And were they encouraged to go to white churches, or were they not allowed to worship prior to the Emancipation Proclamation?
Right. So I think the answer is a little bit of both, and it also varies by time period. So if I focus on, say, Virginia, what I've seen in Virginia is in that late 1700s, early 1800s period, there are churches founded by free people of color. One in particular I could think of is in Charles City County. It still exists today. And so that church did permit both free people of color and slaves to attend, but eventually they try to keep the enslaved people out of the church. So enslaved people are always allowed, for the most part, to attend churches that are headed by white people. And some people, I think, are encouraging the people they enslaved to attend church. There are a lot of enslaved people I don't think are attending church at all, or if they're doing it in their own way in the woods somewhere, away from the view of people who are keeping records about that. And there may be some free people of color who are doing the same thing. But as we get into that 1830s period, after the Nat Turner Rebellion in certain cases, the rules become more strict. So for instance, in Virginia, if free people of color or enslaved people are having a religious service, there's supposed to be white people present at the service. And so you'll see records where, 3 people from a white church will attend the church for people of color to, keep an eye on them, or they will have a white minister. And people of color, in some cases, are not supposed to be preaching at all. I think they are, but there's supposed to be a white minister present when it's happening. So.
Well, thank you everyone so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for watching this talk. If you share our passion for early American history and would like to support free programs like this, please consider making a donation to the American Frontier Culture Foundation at frontierculturefoundation.org. Thank you for your support, and we hope to see you in person at the Frontier Culture Museum in Stanton, Virginia.